Howdy, my name is Myrle Krantz. This is our fourth annual observability survey. We cover topics around open source and its importance in observability, which stakeholders, which new areas of the business you're using observability tools in. And also, we're very interested in seeing how AI is developing. Now, we did the survey last year. Last year, we got 1,255 responses. This year, we got a little bit more. We got 1,363 responses. And we do think observability is becoming more relevant, not just for IT, but for more and more parts of the business. And I'm hoping we'll continue to hear from more people with more different roles in your businesses. Within the landscape of observability and open source, there are some things that are maybe not unchanged, but I'd say the change is linear. One example of this, the interaction between OpenTelemetry and Prometheus, still very interesting, still very relevant. OpenTelemetry and Prometheus continue to improve their relationship and develop good compatibility. There's still work to do in there, but there's also some things where the change hasn't been linear, where things are just dramatically different, so much so that they are practically unrecognizable. AI has absolutely rocked the open source world, and open source observability is no different. So at the top line, what we're seeing is that people who see open source as at least somewhat important, those people make up 77% of our survey cohort. Our report doesn't include data about why y'all found open source important, but we do have some top-level quotes that we were able to collect from y'all, and they seem to support some of the ideas that I've presented here. It's also interesting, the importance of open source here varies somewhat by region. So if we just ignore some of the regions with lower response counts, look at Australia. Sorry, y'all, if you want me to stop ignoring you, you need to get more of your colleagues to respond to the survey. So I'm going to just compare the North Americans and the Europeans. Europeans were significantly more likely to see open source as important than North Americans were. And if we look at the years-long push of Europeans for digital sovereignty, this makes a lot of sense. I was at the Open Source Awards right before FOSDEM in Brussels earlier in January? That was a topic that came up repeatedly, that their goals now are to improve their self-reliance. It's also interesting, when we break down the importance of open source instead of by geography, by role, we notice that open source is more likely to be important to SREs and developers and CTOs than it is to be important to engineering managers and directors. And I think that y'all should probably be talking to each other about that. I would be interested to hear what you all learn from each other. What the survey doesn't cover is why y'all think open source is important. So I'm going to make a couple of guesses, this might also explain some of those differences by role and importance to y'all. So open source does a lot of things for companies, and it has a lot of things for individuals. I think executive concerns should probably include creating an exit strategy for your company from your current observability vendor, not because you plan to leave, but because you want to be able to leave if you have to. We had an example of one of our customers who came to us because their observability vendor dumped them unexpectedly. They were able to change very quickly. I assume that's because they had a good open source basis. You might also want to leverage your ability to shift to another vendor in negotiations with your observability vendor. You also want to make sure you have long-term support and an upgrade path for any of the observability components you rely on, whether those are SDKs, collectors, any of the pieces of your observability architecture that you have to install. You want to make sure that you can upgrade those. There's also a general belief that open source components are higher quality because there's more people working on them. And there's also open source tends to be better at interoperability across multiple systems because of those open standards. It's also definitely easier if you've got a widely used open source project to hire people who can use those open source projects. So those are concerns that executives might be bringing. However, it's not just executives who are interested in open source, as we just learned, right? We've also got individual contributors, software developers, SREs, for example. I think at these levels, probably what you're looking for is you want to find the best solution. You've got a problem in front of you. You want to find the solution that best solves it. And open source solutions are often best in class. They're also just easy to evaluate because they're open. You also want to make sure that your skills are relevant when you move on to your next employer. When you learn about an open source project, that continues to be relevant even if you have to switch. And you're looking for a solution that you can customize and sometimes even make upstream changes to. If you have a bug that you discover or a feature that you need that's relatively minor, open source gives you the opportunity to fix that rather than work around it. I also think that there are not just there's not just buyer concerns or individual contributor concerns that drive open source adoption. It also matters if there are people willing to support these open source solutions and contribute to the open source technologies. And this is where observability vendors come in. These are just not very likely to show up in our survey results. But if we go over and look at the contribution counts for OpenTelemetry, you're going to see that 7 of the top 10 contributors to OpenTelemetry are observability vendors. And the remaining ones, the ones that aren't directly observability vendors, probably are also observability vendors like Microsoft, Amazon, or Google. If you look over, this is an interesting difference actually between OpenTelemetry and Prometheus. If you look over at Prometheus, those contributors tend to have more of a user slant. Even if we can't see directly from the observability survey why y'all think that open source is important, we did ask why y'all think OTel is important, and those things are probably related. So 37% of y'all liked OpenTelemetry because it makes switching vendors easier. 41% like it because of ease of adoption and management. This definitely relates to the reasons that I listed out. And it's especially interesting. I don't know if you all followed, but OpenTelemetry tried recently to graduate from incubation at the CNCF and was blocked on a couple of things that CNCF would like to see improved before graduation, especially around ease of adoption and complexity. So y'all are picking OpenTelemetry for ease of adoption, but CNCF would like to see it get even easier. It sounds like a contradiction. I don't think it actually is. I think telemetry collection is actually very complicated just by nature. OpenTelemetry is making this simpler, but simpler isn't the same thing as simple. So if we go a little further and we start comparing some of the OpenTelemetry growth to the Prometheus growth, in importance, we see that 74% of the respondents to our survey are using OpenTelemetry more or about the same amount as last year. 77% are at least investigating OpenTelemetry-based observability solutions. That's very close to the 75% who said open source was at least somewhat important. And those numbers are roughly the same for Prometheus. 77% are at least investigating Prometheus. So, but when we move beyond that sort of broad strokes analysis and dig into what it actually means when we say using Prometheus or using OpenTelemetry, what you all actually mean when you say those things, we see that Prometheus is still the more mature solution. So the number of people who said y'all are using Prometheus in all of your production workloads, or the majority of your production workloads, that's almost 40% of Prometheus users. We look at those same numbers for OpenTelemetry, it's a tad over 20%, so about half of Prometheus maturity by that measure. If we compare that to last year's survey, the questions weren't identical, so this comparison might be a little misleading. But if we compare that to last year's survey, it looks like OpenTelemetry users have actually made relatively little headway on productionizing OpenTelemetry, and that productionization of Prometheus is pretty stable. It hasn't changed much. But that makes it more interesting that so many of y'all are saying that you're using OpenTelemetry more. So this would be another opportunity for y'all to have a conversation and come back to me and tell me why these two things don't quite match up. So if we look at the OpenTelemetry and Prometheus communities, what they're actually doing, we see that both communities are still working really hard to improve compatibility between these projects. At OpenTelemetry Unplugged in Brussels, beginning of February, right after FOSDEM, we had a lot of Prometheus contributors who came in and joined the group We had so many people interested in compatibility with Prometheus that it became an impromptu track at that unconference. There's an article that came out in the new Stack about this. Again, at KubeCon this year in Amsterdam, there were 2 different meetings for maintainers of both of those projects, for OpenTelemetry and Prometheus maintainers to come together. My understanding is they didn't schedule enough time. It went out into the hallway afterwards for like another hour and a half. One of the ideas that I like the best that was discussed at OTel Unplugged is the idea of including the Prometheus exporters in the OpenTelemetry collector. So I think the next piece that we need to dig into, and I'm looking forward to seeing what our AI people say about it, is how open source and AI play in together. Now, some of the pieces of this puzzle are that open source is fundamental to the value of AI. So AI trains on open source, and because all of Grafana's products are open source, AI works really well with our products. At the same time, we've got some interesting pieces where there is an increase in contribution to the open source projects, to the upstream open source projects, to OpenTelemetry and to Prometheus. These projects are getting more and more PRs, are also getting more and more CVEs that are generated by people who are using AI in order to generate that open source. We think that this will cause an increase in velocity for these projects. We're already seeing some increase in velocity for these projects, but it's also a challenge to keep up with all of these extra contributions. So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out in the next year or so, because that rate of change is just accelerating. So I think that y'all should go and check out the full results. You can go to grafana.com and you can find them there. You can really dig in and slice and dice them, maybe see some things that I didn't dive into here. Thank y'all.